Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to have you join us today and to have this important conversation on gender, power, and AI with a fantastic panel. I'm so excited to jump into it. To start, I'd like to introduce myself and the Clayman Institute and share some housekeeping items. I'm Genevieve Smith. I'm the postdoctoral research fellow here at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford. I also founded the Responsible AI Initiative at the UC Berkeley AI Research Lab and teach at UC Berkeley on responsible AI. And I study social impacts of AI with a particular focus on bias in AI systems, especially related to gender and building more equitable and responsible AI systems. A bit about the Clayman Institute. So, since 1974, the Clayman Institute has been at the forefront of conducting research around topics related to feminism, gender, race, and sexuality. And it's brought together communities of interdisciplinary scholars. We've made it our mission to translate gender research to broad audiences, and that's part of what we're doing here today. I'd also like to note for everyone that you're welcome to put your questions in the Q&A box throughout the talk, and at the end of the panel, we'll be getting to the different questions. And if you haven't already signed up for our Clayman Institute mailing list, please visit our website to keep up to date with our research and upcoming events. Okay, with that, let's get to it. So, the premise for the event today is, as everyone here is well aware, AI is reshaping how we make decisions, work, create, and communicate. Gender and power intersect with AI and how it's developed and how it's used over time, as well as how it's managed and governed. And this panel and event is really about that intersection, how AI replicates gender bias and norms, how inequities become encoded, and how we might build toward more feminist, equitable AI futures. So we'll be exploring a couple different talks or a couple different aspects throughout the panel. We'll be looking at different components of upstream model development in AI systems, such as bias in AI systems, and how we might build differently. And looking at downstream things around use and adoption of AI and differential impacts. And throughout all of this, we'll also be examining power structures, infrastructure, and governance. So, with that, I want to welcome up my incredible panelists here to get into our conversation and introduce each of them. It's truly such an honor to have these esteemed panelists who all of whom have been, all of you have really been personal icons for me and inspirations in my own research and work. So, it's such an honor. So Sophia Noble is the David O. Sears Presidential Endowed Chair of the Social Sciences and professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. She's also the director of the Center on Resilience and Digital Justice and co-director of the Mindru Initiative on Tech and Power at UCLA. She serves as a director of the UCLA Data X Initiative and leads work on critical data studies across campus. You may also recognize her from her best-selling book on algorithmic harm in commercial search engines, Algorithms of Oppression. One of my favorites, if definitely put it on your reading list if you haven't read it. And in 2021, she was recognized as a MacArthur Foundation Fellow for groundbreaking work that she's done on algorithmic discrimination. So it's such an honor to have you here. ANGÈLE CHRISTIN is an associate professor of communication and the Richard E. Guggenheim Faculty Fellow and HAI, so the Human Centered on AI, Senior Fellow at Stanford University. She was a former faculty fellow at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research as well, so lovely to be in conversation. And her research looks at the social and cultural impact of digital technologies on AI, as well as AI ethics. She's wrote an award-winning book, Metrics at Work, Journalism and the Contested Meaning of Algorithms. So another one to put on folks' reading lists if they haven't read that. And she leads the Technology, Culture, and Power speaker series here at Stanford. And Catherine D'Ignazio is an associate professor of urban science and planning at the Department of Urban Studies at MIT and the director of the Data Plus Feminism Lab at MIT. Another amazing book for everyone's list is Data Feminism. If you haven't read that one, another one to add to the list. Lots of good summer reading for everyone joining today. This was a book co-authored with Lauren Klein and really is an amazing book that charts the course for more ethical and empowering data science practices. And she's organized Data Against Feminicides since 2019, which is a participatory action research project that I'm sure we'll learn more about during the panel today, and wrote a second book, Counting Feminicide, Data, Feminism, and Action, which is really an amazing case study that looks into how data feminism looks in practice. So really lovely to have you here, Catherine. And SAFIYA and ANGÈLE, just really excited to be in conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes. So, to start, I'd love for each of you to just share, what brought you to studying questions of gender, power, AI. Maybe SAFIYA, you could kind of start with, really what inspired your journey, and then would love to hear from others as well.
Sure. Great. Thank you, Dr. Smith. It's so wonderful to be here with you today and with my colleagues. And what a time, to be looking at these issues as so many of the interventions that we thought we might make through policy feel thwarted, let's say. I'll say that generously. If not just like completely disastrous to imagine, the road ahead. But I've been on the internet for a really long time. I got on the internet pre-graphic user interface in the text-based internet, and this is a lot of gray in here. And I was on, a computer in the 80s also, which is not very typical of most people and certainly not most girls at the time. My mom was in computing, and so I had the opportunity. And of course, I predicted incorrectly. I thought when I experienced a personal computer for the first time at home, who would ever want to sit at a desk on a computer all day? And here I am doing that for a living. So, there's been this kind of personal journey that I've been on alongside the rise of the internet and the platformed internet. And after spending a 15-year career in corporate America and advertising and marketing and public relations, and learning, quite frankly, in the early days, even before we called it search engine optimization, but in the early days of search, what it meant to use that as an advertising technology and kind of grow up professionally, knowing that search technologies were in fact ad tech and that they could be gamed and manipulated, and in fact were by powerful advertising companies and brands. Some of you might even remember those early days of the internet when somebody would buy a domain like generalmotors.com, and then GM would have to buy it from them for thousands of dollars. It's really been amazing to watch the enclosure of the internet happen by major corporations. And I lived through that professionally. And when the recession hit in 2006, I went back to graduate school, and I was so surprised at the way that we were talking about technology. I was at the information school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, top information science, library and information science program. And there was still such a kind of hopeful, wide-eyed way of thinking about the internet and these companies, these upstarts like Google and Facebook, and I think people in academia, quite frankly, were not envisioning. I think there was like defense tech people who were working very clearly at places like the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, and were really crystal clear about technology as kind of DARPA, Department of Defense kinds of projects. And then there was this other kind of more user-centric place where librarians and information professionals and community organizers were thinking about the internet as a site of possibility and liberation even. And so I sat somewhere in that midst, in this quandary of wondering, what does it mean that we had these commercial technology companies, advertising tech companies, who were so powerfully encroaching upon libraries and universities? Of course, you'll remember we had the Google book digitization project was happening as I was entering graduate school, and millions of volumes of European language and English language volumes were being turned over to Google to digitize, and university academic librarians were all behind it. And then they did an about face, a 180, and the lawsuits ensued. And I was in the thick of writing a dissertation about what does it mean that we are ceding so much of our information and knowledge landscape to these companies. And as I was writing that dissertation, and that eventually came a book called Algorithms of Oppression, what I saw is the way in which people were talking about these spaces was with a little bit too kind of high level and universalizing. And that if you looked more closely and deeply and did a closer reading of the results of these systems, you could see profound racism and sexism that were part of the organizing logics, if you will. Now, I want everybody to take themselves back to like, where were you in 2010? But I will tell you that when I was trying to argue that computers were coded with values, and that code was more than just math, which is really the way in which we talked about coding and algorithms. I mean, algorithms were not even a part of our lexicon. That was like computer science and information science jargon. And I was trying to argue that the algorithm was political at a time when that was profoundly unpopular. And so, I'm very grateful to my colleagues here, to all three of you, for the work that you've done, and that all of our sister colleagues and others have done, because it really was women and LGBTQ communities that were on the front lines, and people of color who were on the front lines of arguing around the politics of these systems, and that they were actually discriminatory by design, but also in their output. And the dominant prevailing narrative at the time was that it was user error, that people just weren't using them correctly, right? And of course, policies like Section 230 and other kinds of frameworks within which the modern internet kind of came into existence helped shield, in fact, the truth about the design of these systems. And of course, now finally, thank goodness, 20 years later, we're winning in the courts, and the proof of their malicious design cannot be hidden from view. But of course, so many people who have been harmed around the world by these systems and have had so little recourse. And it's really been the researchers who have helped articulate that, but more importantly, the people who've been victimized by these companies and by these systems. So that's really, how I got into this conversation, and what I feel like I tried to contribute. And of course, now there's so many people in our field, thank goodness, and there's so many things to document about the danger of these systems. And so I'm just part of the community doing this work. Yeah.
So grateful that you have been a leader in this space.
Thank you.
Uh, Catherine, would you like to share a bit about kind of what brought you to this work as well?
Sure. Yeah, actually, Sophia, as you're talking, I was feeling like we're very much the same generation because I think like I have lived through a lot of these different sort of boom and bust cycles of technology, or cycles of hype and techno optimism, and then crashes of optimism. So for me, I my background was as a but like prior to entering academia was as a software developer, programmer during the first dot-com boom times. So I was a woman in tech at a time when where I don't think actually much has changed in terms of like bias in the workplace. I have many stories about things that were said to me or ways that I was treated. For example, in one of my very first job interviews as a programmer, the CEO of the startup said, "Well, I'm going to introduce you to the programmers, but I don't think they're going to think you're a programmer because you don't look like one." So, um, so these types of things, which made me sort of very acutely aware from the beginning of sort of gender dynamics in tech. But in parallel with my own career as a software developer, I was also kind of an artist on the side, making works with technology, often works that were political in nature. Um, and, you know, in that world and kind of the arts world, and I did a lot of work with mapping and cartography. In that world, there was a very robust conversation about the politics of maps. And so I'm talking here in like the 2000s, like 2000 to 2010. Um, and so there was like an acute way in which geographers, cartographers, and map makers were kind of acknowledging the roots of this form of visualization, maps, thinking about its roots in military and imperial and colonial technologies, grappling with that, subverting that, and so on. And then this very curious thing happened, which is I went back to grad school, ended up at the MIT Media Lab at the Center for Civic Media with my beloved advisor, Ethan Zuckerman. So all props to him. Anything negative I say about MIT has nothing to do with him. so, um, but one of the very interesting things, so that now we're at like the 2012, 2014 time period, and the hype at the time in the Media Lab was big data. So again, this like first it's like internet, web, and then it's like social media, web 2.0, then it's big data is the thing. And I was a little bit honestly shocked at I was shocked at the environment. I was shocked at honestly the lack of diversity of people in the environment. But I was also shocked at the lack of critical discourse of technology, coming out of a kind of more critical map making tradition, entering the space where people had like wildly, I thought, naive uh, uh, kind of ideas about what data could be or what it represented. That this was the time where this guy in Wired magazine writes an article that this is the end of theory because we just have data. We need no more theory because the data just like tells us the truth in this kind of like one-to-one representative way or whatever. I was just like, how can somebody actually say that publicly? That seems so dumb, you know? And so, it was there for me that I started to realize that we needed to bring all these critical conversations which were happening about other forms of representation and media. We needed to like bring those into data and technology. And so that's where for me the seeds of the book, Data Feminism, really started happening. And I think too, like again, with my experience of being a woman in tech, a mom in grad school, like trying to have babies in a extremely male dominated elite academic space, just again, kind of made me acutely aware of all of these kind of dimensions that we needed to be paying attention to. So yeah, that's kind of how I kind of came to the conversations. And then now, again with AI, then we moved from big data to algorithms. That was the hype. Now we've moved from algorithms to AI, now to generative AI. Like these are these cycles that keep going. And I think there's like a certain sameness in terms of like this like gold rush mentality of like, oh, this is the new thing. Everyone has to talk about this new thing. So in a way, like it's almost very annoying to talk about AI because you're just like, oh, do we really have to talk about AI now? And yet at the same time, I actually do think there's something like, again, if we care about looking at unevenly distributed power in the world, which is like, that is the feminist project. I think we look at differentials of power and who amasses and hoards and agglomerates power and who is left without or isolated or marginalized. I do think that the current AI moment represents an acute intensification of resources and power. And I think that's actually happening also as it's connected back to land. Like, so we have land grabs in the form of data centers, we have water and energy grabs, and we have the amassing of massive amounts of capital. And just to put a crazy statistic out there, Sam Altman said recently that by 2033, he wanted OpenAI to have, through its data centers, needed access to as much electricity as the current nation of India uses right now. And so it's a scale of technology and ambition, and also technical architecture that is unsustainable in its ambitions. And so I think that's sort of one of the things that I'm more worried about now, I guess I would say, than I was back in when we were talking only about big data and like the end of theory and the consequences for all the people sort of like left out in the cold there. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean we're to your point, I mean we are in this period of kind of more data and more compute equals more capabilities and this just intensification, as you said, of resources and power to achieve that kind of calculation and this, what does that mean for the environment, for the world more broadly, and this kind of unsustainability piece of it. Absolutely. And I think another point that you bring up that still echoes so true is this idea that data is the truth, this neutrality of algorithms and AI. I think that's such a sticky, for some reason, that's such a sticky idea. I'd love to kind of circle back on that because you see the same language still used even after so much research to the contrary. So I'd love to
Yeah.
circle back on that. But Angèle, would love to hear from you as well about your story.
For sure. So thank you so much for organizing this and kind of bringing us together. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's interesting because I think my stories are both echoes and differences. So I grew up in France and had no access to the internet at all. Literally didn't have an email address until 2005. So, just like a pretty different thing. And I come from sociology and, kind of critical French sociologist where, we think a lot about power, we think a lot about kind of extraction, we think a lot about kind of gender dynamics. But what was really interesting, both kind of back in France and then when I moved to a sociology program, a PhD program in the US, was that technology was seen as being outside of all of these dynamics of power that sociologists care so much about. You know what I mean? And, technology was seen as like, well, a great method, a great tool, you know what I mean? A neutral tool or a great way to communicate. And so I think that for me, kind of coming to the study of tech was just this like, wait a second, like, society and like the dynamics of power do not stop outside of technology. Technology is power, or to put it differently, it is a crystallization of a specific set of power dynamics that then gets kind of stuck within kind of a set of artifacts, right? That then kind of spread at scale and kind of keep us kind of on these kind of specific structures of kind of, gendered, racial, economic, LGBTQ plus kind of inequality, and kind of accentuates the kind of like distribution of power, right? And so that was really kind of my own journey. I started that by looking at newsrooms and how basically news institutions were kind of facing the arrival of the web. And so that was kind of the late 2000s, right? And at the time, yes, it was big data. Like big data was what everybody was talking about. And so that's where I think I joined the same trajectory as SAFIYA and CHRISTIN. And, it was like, oh my gosh, like we are going to break the unilateral, unidimensional flows of information. Everybody's going to be able to participate. This is going to be fantastic for democracy. It's going to be fantastic for society. Finally, like, these hierarchies are breaking down. I mean, also kind of utopian kind of views of what the web could accomplish and what digital platforms could do. And so I think that from my perspective, it's been kind of really fascinating to see like the whole arc from these early hopes, right? Which like, admittedly also from the beginning, and that's some things that, SAFIYA and CHRISTIN have shown very well, were so gendered in themselves, right? That there was this kind of like metaphor of the digital frontier, right? Which came with kind of settler colonialism and extremely kind of masculinist vibes, right? That like it was going to be kind of for white guys to kind of like conquer this digital frontier. And that's very much how journalists, even at the time, kind of saw it. To like this kind of like flip over the past 15 years, to like, I think, a fully dystopian kind of environment, honestly, where it's very clear that like all of the choices that were made in the early 2010s and before that in the 2000s have kind of matured into an ecosystem that is so concentrated and that have made kind of, being online so kind of discriminatory for all kinds of marginalized kind of populations. And so I think it's been just really quite a ride to see these dynamics kind of solidify and amplify over the past 15 years. And that's certainly also been my kind of experience as a faculty member at Stanford, which I joined in 2016. And I mean, I think one of there are people on campus, including at the Clayman Center, which has been such a wonderful resource, kind of, advocating for more critical views of technology, paying attention to the values that are embedded into it, paying attention to how technology increases inequality and phenomenon of extraction, for example. But it has felt sometimes like, being a bit in the desert in the sense that the machine kind of carries on. And we certainly see that with the AI moment, right? In the sense that it is full speed ahead, like everybody has to do large language models all the time. And I very much kind of, joined SAFIYA and Catherine saying like, there is a bit of an interesting thing because in many ways, large language models or generative AI, as they're often called, and diffusion models, it is the same problems, and really it's a kind of logical continuation of what scholars and activists have been saying for the past 15 years, right? But at the same time, it does feel like now, because it's a new technology, there is this need to reinvent the wheel, right? And everything has to be kind of talked about in this different way. So anyway, these are some of the questions that I'm grappling with. But again, coming to it as a sociologist, really interested in kind of questions of power, and not only I would say the distribution of power, but also what's the cultural landscape that legitimizes these technologies and the harms that they can have. And I think that's where the kind of like utopian narratives that has been so important in the making of Silicon Valley continues to shape how, for example, AI is being broached, right? That's some things that will all take us to a better place when we see what's actually happening. This is, in fact, a concentration of power of the scales that we have rarely seen, and that really reminds one of the Industrial Revolution almost. So yeah, so these are some of the things I'm thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we're to your point. I mean, this crystallization of power dynamics that technology does and doesn't have to be that way, but has been showing in this kind of full speed ahead moment that we're in. And, I absolutely resonate with the cultural landscape legitimizing the technology and in the moment that we're in with, AI and generative AI, it's almost this, kind of narrative of winning the race that, we have to go full speed. We have no choice but to go full speed. And, things like bias and discrimination will, paying attention to those might slow us down in this bigger race or something. There's kind of this, narrative that's happening, which I'd love to circle back on a little bit later. But SAFIYA, you've done such pioneering work in the space, algorithms of oppression, looking at how biases that women of color face in search engines and algorithms. And, it strikes me as I was rereading the introduction, as I mentioned a bit earlier this morning on my patio, and about how chatbots today are used for search and these kind of same patterns of sexism and racism present in those outputs. And so I was curious if you could maybe just share a bit more about your work, the concept of algorithmic discrimination, and how do you see that kind of manifesting similarly or differently in, the chatbot searches of today.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think, this desire to kind of, the early search environment for people who weren't on the internet, let's say looking for things pre Google, Yahoo, Lycos, Alta Vista, in the olden days, we used to go into chat rooms, go to bulletin board systems, um, be in networks, sometimes in like early web 1.0 platforms like a Black Planet or Mi Gente or iVillage, some of these places where women and people of color were. And you really understood the kind of subjective nature of your engagement, that you were talking to other people. You were exchanging information with people. And, I think that probably is one of the reasons why it was quite easy to imagine that the technology was just a tool. And all of those early analogies, like it being like, the same type of telecommunications infrastructure that we had, let's say, with the telephone or the telegram. So, that, of course, is very different than today's environment where you might be engaging with a bot. You have no ability to know, the rise of search really, for many people, became a frictionless, which is one of Silicon Valley's favorite words, even though you can't, the human body can't even function without friction. Like, I mean, we could just go into a whole thing about like why friction is so important and necessary on planet Earth. But we'll put that aside for the moment and just say that this idea of being in a frictionless environment where you might open up a blank white page with a simple box and type in a couple of keywords, the fewer the better, and somehow, quote unquote, magically, the best ideas would rise to the top. And so there's a lot of like frameworks upon which that hangs. Certainly, this idea, I tell my students all the time, nobody holds up the foamy finger at the football game that says we're number 1,399,000. This idea that the first is the best, and that is why what comes up on the first page is so important. Rests in a cultural logic. And that was one of the things that, that gets invisibilized, let's say. Of course, there's also the whole lore, the mythologies about the smartest people in the world being engineers and being concentrated in a place like Silicon Valley and being given money because they're the smartest, even though that's not how the flows of capital actually work. They don't actually link up to meritocracy. But you have all of these kinds of dimensions of social organization that are completely obfuscated from the technology, but upon which the technology is organized within those logics. And I think that continues to be the focus of my work, is to try to reveal those things. Like ANGÈLE, I'm a sociologist, and so I can only think about these terms, in like kind of like the social structures, the political, economic, social structures, the ways in which race, class, and gender intersect, maybe sexuality. And I think that now you have not only more of these mythologies upon which new technologies are introduced or new products are introduced into the marketplace, but you also have, a sense that it wouldn't exist if it weren't legitimate on some terms. And basically venture capital doing that legitimation, and or companies, the large monopolies, killing off any possibility for alternatives, right, through their acquisitions, and then, just deading any kind of competition or extracting the best parts of those systems and integrating them, and then, killing off the rest. And so that kind of economic model as well that undergirds what we have, we wouldn't have that in other industries. And so it's these stories that we tell about technology and this kind of cultural framing of tech as embedded with the best and brightest, the great men of science mythologies that, of course, have prevailed in lots of different industries, but certainly dominate in the tech industry. I know Catherine could really go hard on that, so it's like these things to me are really important, because if we imagine what happens in the tech industry in another industry, like let's say pharmaceutical, we would never allow a few guys to go rent some space in a strip mall, batch up a bunch of chemicals, roll it out at CVS and Walgreens, to millions of people. And then when those people are harmed by that concoction, say, well, they just didn't use it right, or hey, it's just chemistry. Like we just wouldn't do that, but that is what we do around technology. The frameworks that we use and the lack of accountability and the way that we don't even talk about them like products or harmful consumer products, for example, or discriminatory products. So I think that work is still a heavy lift, that kind of narrating what are we doing here, and that's really been like the focal point probably for me of the last 5 or 6 years is just kind of trying to story tell better what is happening here. And of course, field building, which is the dozens and dozens of PhD students that are coming through graduate school and trying to support them because they are also doing really important work and bringing forward how discrimination is happening through algorithmically driven systems or AI driven systems. And picking apart even these terms like AI, like what is that? Because that means that term does a lot of work, and again is an obfuscating kind of word. So that's kind of where I am right now in the field of trying to make a contribution. I personally just will say in the last 6 months or so, I've been on sabbatical and I've been taking up lowbrow art. And by that, I mean, I'm doing stand-up comedy and I'm doing stand-up comedy about the tech industry. And I'm doing that because, I just want to talk to different people who have a hunch that something is amiss because the public is generally hostile toward, or very distrusting at least, toward AI and the AI industries for all the reasons that ANGÈLE and Catherine have talked about. And so trying to meet people where they are too, which is usually in a comedy club with a 2-drink minimum and, a babysitter and in a place where they need some type of somatic relief from the times, and trying to introduce these conversations even there.
Okay, we're gonna need a schedule of your next performances.
Everyone's like, why isn't it on the internet? I'm like, I don't know, I just have to be there.
That's amazing. That will go in the
I
follow-up
personally
email.
cannot wait to see this. Like, I think I need this in my life right now, actually. So,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. I love that so much. But yeah, I mean, I think the field building work and supporting grad students, I mean, I'd love to circle back later around, I think this is a really hard time to be a more, junior researcher studying these topics related to just, resources aren't going into these topics. And anyways, we'll circle back on that later, but would love to kind of talk more about how more junior researchers and ones that are even, who are starting their careers in these spaces or expanding their careers in these spaces, how to kind of find support in these times. But thanks so much, SAFIYA. So, Catherine, kind of segueing from that, of course, Data Feminism is such an amazing book and has been an inspiration to me in my work. And I was wondering if you could just share, how do AI systems learn from and replicate gender bias and inequality, perhaps for those in the call who aren't familiar with that. And, how do the issues that we've seen and known from other types of AI show up similar, like more traditional algorithmic decision-making tools show up similarly or differently when it comes to generative AI? So perhaps some level setting for folks on the call.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think I'm still struck by SAFIYA doing stand-up. I like really want to see it.
Yeah,
So you all, one
to that
of the things like
too.
I really feel like is we don't have enough humor right now. It's like so
Yeah,
dark, like it's all
We
dark
need it.
times, and so I just love that you're doing humor. So
a boot camp for stand-up would be great for all of us,
yes,
actually. We'd
maybe
love
we
Yeah,
need like
I'm
summer
gonna
camp stand-up
yeah,
for tech
We're coming
I'm
to
gonna
you.
get the
We're coming to
syllabus
LA.
ready for us, okay? So we can do this.
Um, yeah, okay. So yes, okay. So as far as, gender biases go, it's really honestly not that different from what we were writing about in data feminism and what many people have pointed out. Um, but actually, I love the point that SAFIYA just made, though, because again, if we're talking about sort of these upstream and downstream things, like I love that you pointed to um, the really significant role that venture capital has in shaping and accelerating the production of these products, which are basically untested, no democratic process to even say like, should this exist or not? And of course, no regulatory, like no regulation environment, basically no safety checks and so on. So like, I think that's really, I think that's a really important kind of like upstream shaper of all these things before we even get to like the role that like the technical systems play. So like, I think that's one kind of input to consider for like, how do we get these like deeply racist, sexist, transphobic, anti-LGBTQ, et cetera, systems. But then, another thing that, many people have pointed out, and, SAFIYA's work, for example, Ruha Benjamin, like many other scholars have pointed to the data input that one uses in the system. So it's like, again, when we think about data, what are we talking about when we're talking about data? We're talking about information that has been systematically collected about the world in some form, like in a spreadsheet or in a database. But just putting something into a spreadsheet doesn't magically make it true or magically make it neutral or magically make it more comprehensive. So a lot of the work that I've done over the years with data feminism has been about thinking about the politics of data, not only like, let's say, bias in the data that we do collect, like it's biased against women or biased against people of color, something like that, but even bias in what information we decide is important enough to know about in a systematic way. And so Lauren and I in data feminism talk a lot about this idea that comes from Mimi Onuoha, actually, which is missing data. So this idea that there are data that like there is a political demand for certain types of data, but those data don't get prioritized by our institutions. They don't get collected because ultimately data are actually like one has to invest to produce data. It's an act of production, it's like creating an artifact in the world. That is what it is to produce a data set. And there are many things that our institutions, our governments, our scientific apparatus like doesn't care to know about. And so one of those is around gender-based violence. We have really poor data on gender-based violence. We have really poor data on maternal mortality. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted how we have really poor data at the national scale around evictions. We're trying to track homelessness and evictions, and it's like literally pretty much impossible at a national scale. So, I mean, even that is a kind of an issue. That's a kind of politics of data, starting at like ground zero. But then we get the data that actually do get fed into these large systems. And so, like, I think it's pretty easy to see how gender, racial bias, all sorts of other biases, when your large language model is trained on like Reddit, like how like the users of Reddit are not like scientifically representative of the entire global population, let's say. This is how we get data that are biased. This is also how we get a preponderance of that we get our large language models that work really well in English, do really poorly on other languages. Is how we get this kind of geographic bias, North American type of bias, and so on and so forth. And then, then as we move, I think, into the generative AI kind of world, it's like, again, you have all these like kind of flaws, inconsistencies, like this kind of deep unevenness, even in systems that proclaim that they are somehow comprehensive or representative of all the world's knowledge. That's completely not true. There are many things that are not written down in the world. And so like those don't get fed into large language models. So you get that. And then those are the systems that then generate images or that then generate stories, words, and so on. And so we just see many of the very same problems that we've been seeing all along. So I was going to cite one study, which I can put in the chat. This is not by myself, but it's by Hadas Kotek and some co-authors, but it's about gender bias and stereotypes in large language models. So they did an audit study where they sent many thousands of prompts, two large language models, demonstrated consistently, and they're about gender, intersections of gender and occupation, and demonstrated that all of the frontier models were consistently biased against women in terms of their outputs. And not only that, when they were asked to do more generative work, so not only did they reflect existing cultural, gender inequalities, but they actually exacerbated those inequalities, right? So we also have to think about the work that these systems are doing. Like, they don't just reflect back our own social biases, which is often the argument. Of course, it's like garbage in, garbage out. Like, it's more like garbage in, extra more garbage out, or something like that, right? Because they're actually reproducing, but at scale, those biases. So they do this like kind of extra kind of like exponential harm work in the world. Um, and then the last thing I'll say on this as well is it does then always like tie this full circle back to venture capital and money, through a story about Grok. You guys probably saw, given that the audience is here, folks were probably following, back in December, January of this past year, there was this big outcry because users discovered en masse that they could send a picture to Grok of typically a woman or a girl were the pictures, and they would say, Grok, put her in a bikini, or Grok, put her in a transparent bikini. And so Grok would then take that image in, output an image of that person, but undressed, either in a bikini or in a transparent bikini with their like nude body visible underneath. And within the space of like 6 weeks, something like 3 million of these images were produced. Many of the images were actually of girls. So like people under the age of 18, actually that's illegal in certain jurisdictions. And what was most, I think, telling about this was actually the XAI's response when folks came to them who were outraged. What they decided to do, their first response was not to stop that practice. Their first practice was also not to apologize to all the people who were harmed with non-consensual nude photos, like deep fakes of themselves. Their response was that they monetized that feature. So they actually made it a feature that was available to paying subscribers. And so like this is also how we get the propagation of gender bias, is we have companies that think that that is an okay practice, to not only non-consensually undress women and girls, but then to profit off of that and to make money off of that. And so I think that's, again, it's like there's so many of these like layers, and I think we have to consider it along all of these scales.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a scary reality, really, but definitely important to think about all those layers. And as you were talking about the gender bias stereotypes in LLMs, I've done some work with some colleagues looking at gender bias in text image models and from a global perspective. And similarly, we found essentially this kind of default to male, this like androcentrism beyond, looking at kind of occupations and activities that have relatively equal representation in the real world statistically. There's a default to male and gender neutral outputs. And in high power occupations, that's especially true. So there's even a higher default to male, almost near 100% in many cases, even when real world statistics are closer to, say, 40% of women or whatnot, or 50 and even 60. And then we also see these kind of really gender stereotypes, this kind of feminization of women as young, smiling, thin, and that's true, globally in different country contexts. And this hyper masculinization of men as well. So the gender bias kind of goes both ways, men as serious, fit, muscular, this kind of idea of what it's meant to be a male. But that kind of androcentrism we see that exacerbated in countries with higher gender inequality. And so really kind of interesting trends, and similar to what you're saying, from our research, we found that the training data is a big part of that bias, but also it's kind of the ways there's an unexplained aspect that's probably linked to the ways the models are learning from patterns and replicating those patterns that amplify them beyond the real world statistics. And then, of course, the erasure of binary. or the erasure of non-binary rather that we're seeing, and lower comprehension for non-binary people. So I think all of this stuff is, yeah, these really kind of interesting and important things to be uncovering. But I appreciate that. And Angèle, kind of building, I think, a bit from also the points that are made around VC and the points that are made around kind of why these things are persisting, perhaps something kind of higher power dynamics. I'd love to turn to some of your work around, why these can persist. And you've done a lot of research around kind of institutions' priorities, so things like efficiency, profit, speed, risk management. And how do you see kind of institutions' priorities shaping kind of gendered outcomes we see in AI systems or other outcomes? I know you've done a lot of research on these kind of aspects.
Yeah, I love this discussion. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about, what are the key characteristics of Silicon Valley as like an institutional kind of landscape, right? That kind of ended up kind of determining the kind of hellhole we all live in, kind of online, so to speak. And I think venture capital is so important. And here I want to kind of praise the work of Ben Shostakowski, who wrote a book on kind of the role of venture capital in shaping kind of startup cultures, in part because venture capital, by prioritizing this kind of high risk, high reward thing, really kind of pushed this logic of scale, right? And this kind of build first, expand first, get the data first, with kind of, shall we say, a very casual relationship to the intellectual property of others, right? It's like it's all of our data that's getting mined here. We never agreed, we never consented in most cases, and in many cases we were kind of coerced into it through terms of use that is just a box you click and you kind of move on with your day because you have to use the systems. So build first, expand first, and you'll deal with the problems later. And I think the parallel with pharmaceutical that SAFIYA made is so interesting, right? Because it's just like, what a casual approach to kind of systems building. And that is the world that Silicon Valley has created. I think a related thing, and that's really related to kind of venture capital, is kind of the focus on entrepreneurs and entrepreneurialism as like a valued category, right? Coded white, coded male, obviously, and how that has also really shaped kind of who gets to kind of design these technologies, right? And who gets to benefit from them. Again, never the users, right? But almost always a very kind of narrow group of people who were at the right place at the right time. So thinking about kind of, so, when you have these logics of scale, kind of what happens. And here I want to talk about two kind of slightly different things. The first one is something I've been thinking a lot about over the past kind of 15 years, and it's this logic of engagement, right? The fact that engagement online has become the North Star, kind of usually translated into a bunch of metrics and kind of KPIs, like key performance indicators that, everybody has to kind of follow. And that, both in kind of traditional kind of big data and algorithm stuff and in large language models are really kind of so essential to understanding, again, how these models are designed, right? So for example, with large language models and agents and chatbots, I mean, again, they want to keep you engaged for as long as possible, right? And so that's going to shape a lot of what the structure of interactions look like. And that means that, that's what like a lot of people have talked about as sycophancy. But sycophancy also is so gendered, right? In the sense that it's going to kind of reinforce kind of the views that you're projecting onto the chatbot and kind of pander to you and kind of give you more, you know what I mean? And so that's kind of a big part of it. Same with, social media, obviously, which, I just spent quite a lot of time looking at. And I think the Grok example is so telling there. That, yeah, I mean, I think that platforms have all defaulted to like, okay, engagement first. We won't really deal with the harms because, you know what, our economic bottom line is there. And so that definitely has taken kind of a very sharp turn over the past couple of years with kind of the kind of political changes, right? And the fact that suddenly tech companies were just like, yeah, okay, let's show our true colors, and again, full speed ahead. So that's kind of the first thing. So second things that I've been thinking a lot about is kind of how technology is used as a fig leaf, or not a fig leaf, but I guess how technology is used as an argument for corporations to kind of like amplify some of the kind of harmful dynamics that, they were already doing. And so I think that for me, it's fascinating to see that even though with large language models, the question of like what they're actually good for is, I think, really still up in the air. I mean, it's obviously a very powerful technology, don't get me wrong, but it's like concretely, what are people going to do with that except chat to kind of, get like medical diagnosis that are not approved by any kind of like, licensed physician, or like kind of, get recipes or code, right? And I think that for coding, it's very good. But that also then in turn means that people who code kind of have an overinflated view of what large language models are good for, right? But what's fascinating and what's been kind of really kind of scary to watch is how corporations, in technology, but also like everywhere else, basically use kind of the rhetoric of AI and of kind of AI is all powerful. AI brings these productivity gains. Again, like not clear at this point, but the rhetoric is there to basically then reinforce kind of power, gender, and racial kind of inequality within the corporations, right? By cutting entry-level jobs, so kind of really, cutting down jobs for kind of young people, which kind of then brings questions of kind of intergenerational justice that are really important. And that's something that as a teacher, I really see and feel. But also then kind of tending to kind of automate or say that they're going to automate jobs that tend to be coded more as female, for example, right? By saying like these are the jobs that are going to go out the window, and all of this kind of being really implemented from the top down. So I see kind of AI in the current moment as not only an extremely problematic technology with all of the gendered and racial and kind of economic bias that we've just talked about, but also as a rationale, you know what I mean? A kind of like cultural kind of artifact that is being used to just kind of not only continue doing business as usual, but actually a bit like what Catherine was saying, kind of amplify a lot of dynamics that were already going on. And again, it's hard to kind of pinpoint how much of this is AI, how much of this is like Silicon Valley having achieved such a dominant ideological position. I mean, you look at media headlines, and almost all of them are about the same five guys. You know what I mean? I mean, which we're all calling by their first name because like we see them all the damn time. You know what I mean? And then kind of political change, right? And the fact that like with the Trump administration, a lot of kind of discourses around race, gender, and inequality have become completely legitimized, right? And it's just like, okay, yeah, no need for guardrails anymore. Let's just go down to kind of doubling down on that. And so I really see these kind of three things working together in ways that are extremely problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, yeah, the discourse around race and gender inequality in from the administration and even the, preventing woke AI and the federal government kind of executive order from last summer has really positioned bias mitigation as this kind of ideological meddling. And maybe briefly on that, we are seeing this political effort to reframe bias mitigation as ideological in AI. This kind of leftist agenda, and more recently, XAI sued Colorado, my home state, for its anti-discrimination AI legislation, which is focused on high-risk AI systems and things like hiring and healthcare. And in the lawsuit, they claimed that the company's Grok chatbot would be forced to promote, quote unquote, the state's ideological views on various matters, racial justice in particular. And then at the end of April, so just a couple weeks ago, the Department of Justice joined XAI in suing Colorado on this bill, even though the bill has since been watered down quite significantly. And of course, we have research on bias in AI that's extensive and peer-reviewed around how these systems aren't neutral. And I'm curious, how do we make sense of this reframing of this moment and kind of what are the stakes when evidence-based accountability gets cast as a political agenda? Any thoughts around that one?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is I remember writing in Algorithms of Oppression that, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, we have this moment in, let's say, modern American history, US history, where women and people of color, mostly women, mostly in fact white women, um, now cannot legally be discriminated against in the workplace in particular. So you have an influx in the 1970s and 80s of women into the managerial class across our society, where women and marginally people of color can become decision makers and manage resources and run organizations, corporations, public institutions. And alongside that, you have the rise of the idea that computers can make better decisions than people. And for me, those things are absolutely connected. And that is how we can get to a moment like today. Like if we take a longer view, this actually didn't come out of nowhere. We had a reconsolidation, a reinscribing of power into the same historically dominant uh, class of people in our society, and doing that through computing, quite frankly, as one of the ways. So that we talk about computing as being inherently discriminatory by design in all the ways that Catherine has talked about, by impact in the way that ANGÈLE is talking about. I mean, this is actually the project. And, there's a fantastic new film out right now called Ghost in the Machine that just premiered at Sundance, with all of our colleagues are in. And, it's about the eugenicist origin story of computing, right? And I mean, sorry to say this at Stanford, but then, we could look more closely at places like Stanford too, and the role that they've played institutionally in these worldviews. So to get to a place where you can capture the federal government and the Supreme Court and many federal courts and implement, codify that agenda more concretely, that's actually what we're seeing. I think we might cut in on it in a little more of a shallow way of like saying we're trying to deal with like bias mitigation, but the project has been about a particular ideological disposition, and consolidation of power. And many people have written about the profoundly anti-democratic worldview of many leaders in Silicon Valley, the ones that we know by first name, unfortunately. And so, for them, democracy is messy, voting is messy. I mean, we all have seen their interviews. What's shocking to me is how we ascribe a kind of generosity to them rather than looking at their direct words. Their direct words tell us everything about who they believe should be in power, what they think of the kinds of equitable worlds that we imagine, which we can also call feminist worlds. They're very direct that these systems are about replacing labor, creating a world of purely dependent people on them that they can control. They are very clear about their depopulation strategies. They're very clear about the metal wombs they'd like to design and their designer babies, and precluding women completely, even from reproduction, biological reproduction. So we can just go look at what they have to say. And that then I think takes us out of the place of wondering what the agenda is. That is, to me, why you see the assaults in Colorado and California and all of the places. And the incredible part is that we've been able to finally start to have some new case law and precedent being set by the litigation that's happening against these companies, because they're also very arrogant and comfortable and too loose. And that maybe ANGÈLE, you have a better view on this from Europe, but I would say that these kind of fascistic ideas, you know, um, what is helpful is that they're not very smart and don't have a lot of like staying power. Do you know what I'm saying? So, and they kind of start eating their own and each other, which is, I think, also what we're kind of witnessing right now in the United States in politics. So, that might also mean what I think is that the views that they hold are not going to have long-term staying power. So the question for us is, how will we build pro-social, rights respecting, anti-surveillance, civil and human rights, promoting democratic technology ecosystems as a counterweight. And that, I think, there are millions of people primed and ready for, and in fact, quite frankly, want desperately.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'd love to turn to that before we kind of open up for questions. I see we have a couple questions from the audience, so feel free, folks, to put those in the Q&A. But I think that something I've seen in all of your work is this, the idea of imagining the world we want, right? We've talked a lot about the challenges and the issues, which are very real, and these power dynamics that are very real. And at the same time, we can build different types of technologies, build different types of worlds. We can imagine the worlds that we want. And so I guess a kind of open question to all of you is, can AI be feminist and how? And, when we think about imagination and the world we want, what does that look like? So any thoughts around feminist AI? I know maybe Catherine, I can start with you since you've thought a lot about feminist AI and kind of that imagination.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just wanted to also echo something that SAFIYA was just saying in response to your prior question too, which is I do think like the part of our work right now in the anti-woke, in this anti-woke moment, is to repoliticize exactly the agenda that SAFIYA is describing, which is a eugenicist agenda, it's a fascist agenda, it's a white supremacist agenda, it's a pro-natalist agenda. It is not a neutral agenda. So like people coming in with the anti-woke politics are not actually articulating that they want a kind of return to neutrality. They're articulating a deeply violent alternative. And so I think that's maybe our challenge is to like repoliticize that agenda and sort of uncover it and expose it for what it is. And I think you're so right, SAFIYA, to like point to like their exact words, because if we look at like if you read Mark Andreessen's ridiculous techno-optimist manifesto, like he's quoting from Marinetti, who is an Italian fascist, who Marinetti is this like poet who wrote the Futurist Manifesto in the early 1900s, who literally joined with Mussolini and like burned down a newspaper office and participated in the early Italian fascist movement. So he's directly using his words and his concepts. We have Nazi salutes directly at presidential inaugurations. We have Palantir, who's using Western civilization and decadence, like just very familiar fascist tropes as ways of like recruiting people and also promoting this agenda to get more government contracts. So it's like, I think, again, we just have to like turn the lens back on these things. And I sort of resent this because I have spent a long time trying to ignore the like wacky billionaire stuff, but I actually think we're at a moment where it's doing so much violence and harm that unfortunately I do think we have to sort of focus on it. But so to your question about like feminist AI, like, I think under the current political economy of AI, I don't think feminist AI is possible in the sense that like I don't think we can do feminism with ChatGPT. Like I really don't think that is possible, and it is because of who owns and governs the technology, right? Like it's very similar, I think, to what Allison Adams, who wrote this very early book about feminist AI, like from the 1990s. She has this great part of this book where she's like speculating about this question of like, can we have feminist AI? And she kind of lands on this like, I don't know, because like could you have a feminist fighter pilot? Like that's kind of what we're asking here. We're asking what is essentially a technology of class war and violence to be feminist. Like that, I think is not possible necessarily. So, like, no, in certain circumstances, under certain definitions of AI. But like, I think there is possibility for us to organize ourselves differently in relationship to technology, rethink our relationships of ownership and governance of data and AI, including down to the infrastructural level of like who owns the servers and like where do they live and what's the cloud and how much like governance do we have over the cloud and things like that. There, I think there is like absolutely potential. And we see many of these kinds of smaller experiments, which are not only about like taking a, you know, frontier model and kind of like turning it to be feminist or something, but more about rethinking some of the social relations and reclaiming ownership and governance and reestablishing those relationships in the absence of a state doing like anything meaningful to rein in these companies. So that's sort of where I land. And then maybe I'll give you a very concrete example, which is we did do in the counting feminicide work, we did do a collaborative project that we built AI technology with activists who were working to produce data about feminicide. So these are groups that they in various different places, mainly in Latin America, but they try to document every case of feminicide, at least that gets reported in the news. Part of their work was scouring news reports. And so one of the things that we did is we collaborated, my lab and a couple of collaborators of mine collaborated with the activists to create, I guess it's AI. Like we didn't ever talk about it as AI until now because like everyone's talking about AI, but it's basically a technology that helps to streamline the work that they're doing that goes out and scans every night all of the different media in their country, finds possible cases of feminicide, applies a model that we trained to use the activist definition of feminicide, which is more expansive than the legal definition, delivers those cases for consideration to the activists. And I think it's worth saying, like it's a very simple model. It's not a generative model. It's not a large language model. It's not using. It's not interfacing or paying anything to the big tech companies. But it does do this one specific task well, and that is a task that the activists wanted. And I think what's very important is that we engage in a kind of democratic process, one which our companies have not, like they don't engage in the democratic process, but to say like, do you want this? If so, on what terms? And then also like, which parts of your work do you want to automate? And, you know, it turned out that some of the work they did want to automate. And then our team proposed to automate even more of the work. And the activists pushed back on us. And they said, no, like you can't automatically extract the data, like the names, perpetrator name, date, place of the where the case happened, and so on. We don't want you to automatically extract all those details because our work, our most important work, is witnessing that violence and acting as a kind of memory keeper for the lives of the women and girls who were claimed by this violence. And we do not want that work automated. And so we didn't do that. And so like, but these are the kind of conversations that are not happening in our other spaces, right? We aren't having still democratic conversations about which things might legitimately be helped by AI or other kinds of technologies and streamlined, and then which things actually are central to the human labor in the process. So I did want to end with kind of an actual example, not to
Yeah.
just,
But
yeah.
I think important, like the distinction too that I'm hearing from you is like, there's like AI is a tool and there's these, kind of traditional algorithmic decision-making systems and AI tools that we can build purpose-built, like small purpose-built to solve certain problems that can help advance, issues related to gender equality and be done in kind of more feminist ways. Like that example I think that you have is a great one. They don't have to be the most complex technology to do so. And then separating that, I think, from kind of the moment of generative AI and this kind of like this idea that we're in kind of like we needs to be like ever larger. And that kind of mentality can be in tension. So I think it's helpful to kind of break out that like AI is not one type of tool or technology. And so when we think about these feminist and alternative futures, we can think about kind of different technologies in that future. Um, but yeah,
Yeah, and I
yeah.
think it's important to like think about exactly these distinctions between like what is the like if we're talking about large language models, there's a very specific technical architecture behind those models that like they need massive amounts of data, they need massive amounts of compute. There are like very significant environmental costs, and there's very significant I would say democratic costs to centralizing so much of that data and information in these, for-profit big tech corporations. That is a very specific architecture that consists that then like downstream like makes for all the it's like very specific political architecture as well, and like that's what's leading to this like data center energy race and all these devastating consequences when we really haven't had the conversation of like, do we need that technical architecture? Because actually we might not. Like actually we might not need these frontier models, right? Like we might actually be able to accomplish a lot of these tasks without such a compute intensive, land intensive, water intensive, energy intensive
Yeah.
architecture
How
behind it.
much we need artificial general intelligence and I mean in the idea too of like smaller open source local models, there's alternatives anyways. But Sophia, I see you came off mute.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, Catherine's got it right. And this is what transnational feminism helps us to understand and to interrogate. I mean, one of the reasons why I have used Black feminism as an analytic and a way of theorizing technology is because if we deal with our Internet of Things, um, then we have to look at mineral extraction and the global politics of mineral extraction in places like the Congo, in Australia, mineral wars, blood minerals. We have to look through the entire global supply chain of manufacture. We take this out of just a software kind of orientation, which is, I think, in the US, how people kind of mostly fixate and maybe a little bit of hardware. We would have to contend with the choices that were not taken up. Of course, many of us had mobile phones back when they were made of components, and you could replace components rather than create more e-waste in terms of hardware. The constant design for disposability, planned obsolescence, all of these kinds of things. So transnational feminism, intersectional feminism helps us contextualize the entire supply chain of information communication technologies, if you will, just to take it back to the past. And then from that vantage point, we might say, yeah, we don't actually need, what is the point of any of it? Irrespective of the fact that it's costing us our mental health, it's costing us our cognitive capacities. Power users of ChatGPT showing up to a 40% cognitive decline. We've invented new terms like digital dementia. We have, young people and every generation addicted to technology, and including all the harms we've talked about. So this is to me what the value of thinking about and this entire apparatus with a feminist view. We might say, how would we more meaningfully connect to, the earth and all of its inhabitants under a different regime? And that, of course, requires an interrogation of capitalism and late stage capitalism. And, it requires an interrogation of the nation state and what its role is in the lives of all people. And we could really imagine something very different that I think is probably in many ways, those imaginaries are even being precluded from us. And as we lose certain kinds of intellectual, spiritual, capacities, um, I mean, we are living through a time right now of the most craven, depraved news about how the power elites in the world have regarded women and children. And then it's like, business as usual the next day. I mean, so we know what, in fact, the digital um, the digital lives we lead have actually not created the possibility for accountability, for repair, for justice. So to me, I'm much more interested in like those kinds of framings because I just think they give us a insight into organizing completely different kinds of worlds rather than tinkering with the mess we have that is contingent upon all of this exploitation globally.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Everything's resonating so much. And I'd love to turn to some audience questions. I know we have a lot, so we'll see how many we can get to. And I think there's one that builds from some of the conversation that we're currently having. And maybe Angèle, I'll start with you. And if you have any other thoughts on the prior question, feel free to add those in. So this is a question that says, many dominant AI narratives seem to narrow our political imagination by framing technological acceleration as inevitable. And maybe I'll throw there too, there's an aspect around adoption that's kind of part of that hype. While democratic intervention becomes increasingly difficult under growing lobbying power of large tech companies over regulation and governance, how do we reclaim collective political imagination in this moment? What forms of resistance or alternative socio-technical futures do you see emerging from feminist decolonial or grassroots movements? So kind of related. But yeah, Angèle, any thoughts that you have, feel free to take that in different directions.
Yes, these are such great questions and such great discussions too. I mean, I think the question of resistance is so important. And as someone who's been studying workers and kind of using ethnographic methods, I'm just really attuned to like what does resistance look like, kind of on the ground and from the bottom up. And I think, the first thing to acknowledge is that we are all complicit. Everybody is complicit. There is no such thing as purity. And at the same time, there are margins for kind of creating more kind of just, more caring, more feminist kind of spaces and future. So holding these two things kind of at the same time, right? That like we are all embedded in various and multifaceted ways within the landscape that is the one we are living in today and the power structures that come with it, of which AI is one manifestation, and admittedly a very powerful one. And we can still push kind of different imagination. So for me, what's been really interesting, I'm thinking about, well, two or three things very quickly. So first one is that, and it came up in the discussion. I think what's really interesting with AI and digital technologies right now is that it's primarily an informational paradigm, right? And that goes with the seamless kind of aspect, right? It's just like information, it's like the classic information wants to be free. It's seeing the world in terms of information that kind of circulates very quickly from one thing to another. Now, I think that what feminist theory tells us is that there is no information without bodies, right? That the embodiment of the world is a primary force and ones that within patriarchal systems always gets erased, somehow. And so something I'm thinking a lot about is like, yeah, what does it look like to move beyond kind of informational paradigms to kind of bring in bodies, right? To bring in embodiment and to bring in kind of what bodies kind of bring to the table. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is that I'm really interested in, and I think that was, aligned with what Catherine was saying, in kind of the path not taken, or the people kind of trying to do things with technology that, go against the kind of status quo, right? And so with a number of students, we're exploring projects, kind of looking at both kind of, for example, marginalized voices within computer science, right? And what does that look like? To kind of, yeah, like grassroots development of kind of software programs to right now, current project looking at how female scientists are using AI for astrophysics, but not generative AI, but kind of much more like ad hoc, custom built kind of models to try to understand the universe in a way that does justice to it. So that's kind of the second thing. The last thing I'll say very quickly is that I think that as an academic, I've been thinking a lot about kind of my own responsibility in the current moment, and I think it goes to what SAFIYA was saying, which is that at the same time that more women and people of color rose into the ranks of academia, that is also when the academic institution is getting decriminalized, like attacked, defunded and kind of severely threatened by large language models, right? With people saying like, well, we don't even need universities anymore. We'll just kind of do LLMs, kind of produce the content, analyze the content. All of this is going to be like hyper efficient and hyper productive. And so I really think that as kind of a feminist academic, I see it as my role right now to kind of push back within my own institution, and thinking about what does care look like? What does community building look like? And I'm really torn about that because on the one hand, being within an elite institution, that comes with its own contradictions. And at the same time, I really think that the logic of scale is such a problematic logic. And so I'm kind of, yeah, I'm, anyway, chewing on that, but, excellent questions for sure.
Oh, I love that. And it's true. I think it is this time where it's like we can use LLMs for different aspects of science and what is the role of research and also as researchers again kind of studying this space and more even more junior researchers studying things like bias and discrimination. It feels like what's my role right now? What are the opportunities? And it seems like fewer and fewer resources. And anyway, so I really appreciate that comment. And perhaps for the final comment, there's a couple questions in here around recommendations. And so maybe that's something we could end with. We'd love to hear from each of you around some recommendations. But we have some questions that are looking at, for those of us working in AI and technology, any recommendations. And I think, that kind of comes in this context where adoption is really kind of being pushed. Of course, these tools can be really helpful for a variety of tasks, but I think there's these big adoption narratives and hype as well. There's also some questions around recommendations for philanthropists. So perhaps starting back with you, SAFIYA, if you could share kind of briefly any recommendations for either folks working in tech, for philanthropists, or junior researchers. You feel free to pick one, but any kind of recommendations for this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're living in a moment right now where philanthropy, for the most part, is kind of retreating from the field. I think it deeply invested, let's say, in the same paradigms that we're critiquing right now for a long time. And then as the kind of feminist tech criticism came into view, I think, it has been, well, one big foundation told me we were getting a fraction of a penny on the dollar. And that I think holds true, especially now under this kind of current political climate where philanthropy is retreating because of the attacks that they're also experiencing and kind of pushing people more toward making. That's a challenge that this is not the moment to retreat because I think all of these things are also about democracy. I mean, we were literally just watched. If you think that AI modeling wasn't used in gerrymandering in Louisiana, you're not reading the news right. This is actually the time, especially with the threats and the attacks on higher education, that we should be tripling down on these researchers and on this research community broadly. And that includes all of the entire pipeline, including new and emerging scholars. And I feel like that pressure and the kind of lack of long-term investment into this kind of research, and I'm not talking about 2-year grant cycles where no one can actually really build a robust research agenda because you're going to have to lay off 5 people in 18 months, which is mostly what all of us deal with. I think that's something that philanthropy has really got to get itself sorted out if it's going to try to be part of the remedies and part of in the partnership with scholars and organizers, and it's really, I think, misoriented right now. I think, we have an incredible, I'm with you, Angèle. I feel like we have this incredible responsibility right now, tenured faculty, to create the conditions inside our own institutions for more people to arrive and do their work. And that is also political work, because while all the austerity measures, for example, in the UC are being implemented, I'm at UCLA, um, uh, uh, you know, I weep over the kinds of decisions that are being made. Hundreds of millions of dollars are pouring in from the tech sector, and they're actually just buying schools of engineering, buying law schools, all over the country, to do their work, to outsource their R&D into our great, public and private institutions, and people who are social scientists, humanists, artists, all kinds of people who are doing this type of work are profoundly unfunded and defunded by these austerity measures. The hits hit us, not these other places. So we have a lot of work to do where we are.
Absolutely. And Catherine, Angèle, any final words they'd like to share on that or anything else?
I'll just say quick recommendations for philanthropy, totally what SAFIYA said, and like in specifically looking at I think philanthropists could play a role in building alternative financing infrastructure to get us to what does an alternative tech infrastructure and ecosystem look like that is not funded by venture capital, that is not driven by for-profit sort of logics. And so like I would love to see that. There's a lot of conversation right now in Europe about digital sovereignty. So like I think we need to think about like how do we get off, like how do we ourselves be sovereign from the big tech logics and build a completely alternative infrastructure. And like that's where money is necessary for sure. For the workers, I was going to say unionize. If you can, unionize, come together. If you can't, if it's a weird, prevent like hard climate to unionize, the first step is political consciousness raising in your workplace. And so like really think about how do you come together with people and build power as workers. I think the tech worker movement has gotten a little deflated, but it is still there. And I think it's could be a huge source of power if we could politicize the workers. And if you're looking for a place to complain and get those folks talking to each other, Ali Akhtaib, I don't know if I'm saying his name properly, but he's running this great massive reading group called the AI Skeptics Reading Group. And I'm in the Signal channel, and it has like all these software developers just like so complaining about everything that's happening in their workplace. So like if you're a person who like loves complaining, which I love complaining, so you should totally join this and commiserate, because I think like being mad and commiserating is like the first step towards political consciousness raising. So those are my recommendations.
Amazing. Thanks, Angèle, or thanks, Catherine. And yeah, definitely alternative infrastructures. Like, what does that look like? I love that. And Angèle, final words from
Yes.
you.
So I think that community organizing for me is the place to go. In part because there are a lot of people who really don't like large language models and really do not like the fact that it's being pushed from the top down on all levels. If you look at polls, it's crazy how unpopular AI is. And yet, what I find fascinating is that in the current environment, many people feel like there is no space to discuss this, right? And to kind of push back, to criticize, to kind of voice questions about societal harms, to voice questions about what these technologies are doing. And so I would really encourage everybody to find these spaces of kind of counter kind of narratives. I will speak just at Stanford. A group of students has just organized a group called Critical AI that aims to bring students across the pipeline from undergrads all the way to kind of faculty to raise some of these questions and have some hard discussions about how do we push back. Of course, there are many other groups like these, right? And so I think that along the lines that my colleagues kind of identified, creating spaces for these discussions to happen is the only way to kind of push back against the kind of giant tsunami of AI hype that we are all facing right now. And it's essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly there's demand for these kind of spaces. I mean, just from the attendance today, from all of the questions that we've gotten. And I wish this conversation could be 3 hours because there's so much that we could talk about. But huge plus one to all of that and having space, and appreciate Clayman for creating this space and for you all for being part of it. So SAFIYA, Catherine, ANGÈLE, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation, this really important conversation right now. I so value each of your perspectives, and and it's been such an inspiration, as I mentioned at the beginning, to my own journey. So thank you so much for being here in conversation, and thank you to all of those who attended today.
Appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you for organizing. Bye, you all.
Bye. Take care.